The first time Oscar Rhodes noticed her, she was standing so still against the bleeding sky that he mistook her for a fence post. It was late September of 1874, and the high plains of western Kansas were the kind of beautiful that hurt a person. All that open amber grass rolling toward a horizon that seemed to exist just to remind you how small you were. Oscar had ridden into the territory 3 weeks prior, having purchased the old McReady homestead from a land agent in Dodge City, with money he had earned over 7 years of cattle driving, trail work, and the kind of hard living that left calluses on a man's soul as surely as it did on his hands. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with a quiet sort of face that people sometimes forgot until they were about to do something they shouldn't, at which point they remembered it very clearly. He had been walking the fence line of his newly acquired north pasture, checking the posts and wire that the previous owner had left in various states of neglect, when he paused at the top of a small rise and looked east across the shallow creek that divided his land from the neighboring property. The sun was dropping fast, the way it did out here, not a gradual dimming but a deliberate falling, the whole sky catching fire as it went. And there, standing at the far edge of a plowed field, was a woman in a dark dress, her arms loose at her sides, her face turned toward that burning horizon. She didn't move for a long time. Oscar stood and watched her, not out of rudeness but out of the same instinct that made a man pause when he came across something he couldn't immediately explain. The stillness of her was extraordinary. Not the stillness of peace, he thought, but something heavier. The stillness of someone who had made an agreement with grief and was honoring it. He found out about her the next morning at Briggs's General Store in the small town of Callow, which sat 6 miles south along the wagon road and served as the commercial and social heart of the surrounding homesteads. Callow was not much to look at: a main street of packed dirt, 8 or 9 storefronts, a livery, a small church whose paint had been surrendering to the weather for the better part of a decade. But it was the kind of place where information traveled freely and without much invitation. Mabel Briggs, who ran the store with her husband Clem, was a woman of generous proportions and equally generous speech, and when Oscar asked, carefully and without apparent great interest, about the farm to his east, she set down the bolt of canvas she had been measuring and gave him the full account. "That's the Donnelly place," she said. "Eliza Donnelly. Her husband Thomas passed on about 14 months ago now. Fever took him in late summer of '73. Left her with those 200 acres and a 6-year-old boy named Sam, and not much else besides the house and the fields he'd broken." Mabel paused to allow the weight of this to settle. "She's been working it herself. Hired on a couple of men come spring, Hector Ruiz and his cousin from down along the Cimarron, and they got the wheat in. It came up decent enough, I'll grant her that, but it's a hard go for a woman alone." Oscar nodded. He bought his cornmeal and his salt pork and his tobacco and rode back to his homestead, and that evening, though he had told himself he wouldn't, he found his feet carrying him to the north pasture at sundown. She was there again. Same dark dress, or perhaps a different one of similar cut, he couldn't say from the distance. Same position at the far edge of her east field, face to the dying light. Her dark hair was pinned up against the back of her neck, and the wind off the plains pulled at a few loose strands of it with a tenderness that the country didn't often show. She stood that way until the last color left the sky, and then she turned and walked back toward her house, and the darkness took her. Oscar stood at the edge of his own land and watched her go. He told himself that evening, while he ate his solitary supper of beans and bread and listened to the coyotes beginning their night conversation, that there was nothing unusual in what he'd done. A man could stand on his own property and look wherever he pleased, but even as he thought it, he knew that wasn't the whole of it. There was something about the quality of her grief that had reached across that shallow creek and laid its hand on him, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with the feeling. He was back the next evening and the one after that. He never crossed onto her land. He never called out to her. He simply stood at his edge while she stood at hers, and the 400 or so yards of dry grass and creek between them might as well have been a country of its own. He didn't know if she noticed him. He suspected she did. Eliza Donnelly did not strike him, even from a distance, as a woman who missed much, but she gave no sign, and he gave her none, and in this way a strange, unspoken communion began. He met her officially on a Wednesday in early October, when a section of the shared fence line along the creek came down in the night during a wind that arrived from the north with no polite warning. Oscar found 3 of his yearling steers on her side of the creek in the morning, happily working through the edge of her wheat stubble, and he went after them immediately, driving them back across with his horse and more apology than the cattle deserved. He was restringing the wire when he heard boots in the dry grass behind him and turned to find her standing 10 feet away, watching him work. Eliza Donnelly was 30 years old, with a face that had been made for something other than the sun and the wind but had adapted to both with a kind of elegant stubbornness. Her eyes were dark gray, the color of creek water before a storm, and they were looking at him with an assessment so direct that he actually straightened up, wire in one hand and pliers in the other. "Your cattle," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Came through in the night. I apologize for any damage." She looked at the wheat stubble, already harvested and not much to damage, and then looked back at him. "The fence has needed work for 2 years," she said. "I'd have done it myself, but the posts are on your side." "I'll see to the posts," he said. "I should have done it sooner. I just got the property settled 3 weeks ago." "I know," she said. "You're the one who bought the Macready place." "Oscar Rhodes," he said, and took off his hat in the kind of reflexive courtesy that had been hammered into him by a mother who considered manners non-negotiable even in hard country. "Eliza Donnelly," she said, without the formal echo. She looked at him steadily for a moment and then said, "Can you set a post properly, or will I need to worry about this fence again before spring?" He almost smiled. "I can set a post," he said. She gave a small nod and turned back toward her house, and that was that. Except that it wasn't. Because that evening she was at her edge again, as the sun went down, and Oscar was at his. And now they had names for each other, which changed the quality of the silence between them considerably. He began working in earnest on that fence line over the next several days, which gave him a reason to be near the creek, and which meant that occasionally, naturally, unremarkably, their paths crossed. She would come down to the creek in the mornings to fill a water barrel, or to check on a section of the bank where the earth was eroding. He would be working on a post or checking the wire tension, and they would exchange a few words, and the words were always about practical things: the coming winter, the price of wheat, the condition of the road to Callow, but they were also, both of them knew without quite saying it, about something else entirely. She didn't talk about her husband in those early conversations. He didn't ask. He learned things about her the way you learn the shape of a country by riding across it, gradually, piecemeal, through what was said and what wasn't. She had come to Kansas from Ohio with Thomas Donnelly in 1866, when she was 22 and he was 26, and they had built the house with their own hands and the help of their nearest neighbor, a homesteader named Walt Prairie, who had since moved on to Colorado. She had planted the kitchen garden and kept it going through 4 droughts and 3 hard winters. She could read and had taught herself to use the almanac and the county records in Dodge City to understand the legal boundaries of her property. She had, in the 14 months since her husband's death, never once considered leaving, which Oscar came to understand was the most significant fact about her. He learned about Sam 6 years old and constitutionally unable to walk anywhere he could instead run, when the boy appeared at the creek one afternoon while Oscar was working and stood on the opposite bank staring at him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of childhood. "You're the new man on the Macready place," Sam said. "That's right," Oscar said. "Name's Oscar Rhodes." "That's 2 first names," Sam said. "It is," Oscar agreed. Sam considered this. He had his mother's dark gray eyes and a scatter of freckles across his nose, and he was carrying a willow stick that he was apparently using to poke at everything within reach, which seemed to Oscar an entirely reasonable way to move through the world at age 6. "My name's Sam," the boy said. "Samuel Thomas Donnelly." "That's a good name," Oscar said. "My papa was Thomas," Sam said. The weight of this was there in his voice, but lightly. A child's grief is real but differently shaped than an adult's, sitting alongside the living world rather than opposed to it. "He died." "I know," Oscar said. "I'm sorry about that." Sam nodded seriously, as though Oscar had said something requiring acknowledgement. "Mama says he can hear us in the evenings," the boy said. "That's why she goes to stand at the field edge, so she can talk to him before the dark comes." Oscar set down his pliers very carefully and looked at the boy across the creek, and something in his chest did a slow, complicated thing that he didn't have a name for yet. "Your mama sounds like a very good woman," he said. "She is," Sam said, with the absolute authority of someone who has never doubted it for a moment. "She makes apple pie and she can shoe a horse and she's not scared of anything." Oscar spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about Eliza Donnelly standing at the edge of her field every evening, talking to her dead husband in the falling light, and by the time he walked back to the north pasture at sundown, he felt something distinctly like guilt about having watched her. He hadn't understood what he was witnessing. He had seen grief from the outside and thought it was a kind of interesting stillness. He hadn't known it was a conversation. And yet that evening, when she appeared at her edge, he found that he couldn't make himself leave. He stood at his edge of the land and he didn't look away, and after a while he understood that his standing there was its own kind of thing, not an intrusion, but a presence. The same way a lamp in a window isn't an intrusion on the dark outside, but simply a light that was there. He didn't tell himself stories about it. He was not a man much given to self-deception. He knew, by the second week of October, that he had started caring about Eliza Donnelly in a way that went beyond neighborly concern and into something considerably more personal. He knew it the way you know a change in weather before it arrives, by the feel of the air, the direction of the wind, the particular quality of the silence. The question was what to do about it, and for a long time his answer was nothing, because she was still standing at the edge of her field at dusk telling Thomas Donnelly about her day, and Oscar Rhodes was not the kind of man who pushed himself into spaces that weren't ready for him. October deepened toward November and the cold came rolling down from the north in earnest, the kind of cold that made the grass stiff and the breath visible, and the mornings feel like a statement of intent from the land itself. Oscar finished the fence line along the creek, properly finished it, with solid posts and good wire that wouldn't come down in anything short of a tornado, and then turned his attention to his own homestead, which had a dozen small disasters waiting patiently for his attention. He was chopping wood behind the barn one afternoon when he heard a horse coming up the wagon road at a pace that suggested urgency, and he straightened up to see Hector Ruiz riding hard toward his gate. Hector was a compact, weathered man in his 30s who worked the Donnelly farm and who Oscar had exchanged brief, friendly words with on several occasions. He pulled his horse up hard at the fence and leaned over the saddle horn with the look of a man who has just run from something. "Mr. Rhodes," he said, "Mrs. Donnelly sent me. She has a cow down with the bloat and the other animals won't settle, and her boy is sick with a bad chest cold. She asked if you had any experience with bloat." Oscar had his coat and his kit bag and was on his horse in 4 minutes. He'd worked enough cattle drives and ranch seasons to have seen and handled bloat more times than he could count, and when he arrived at the Donnelly barn, he moved without hesitation, talking calmly to the distressed animal and working efficiently while Eliza held the lantern and watched him with those storm-gray eyes. She didn't flutter. She didn't apologize for needing help. She simply held the light steady and answered his questions with the precision of a woman who paid close attention to her animals, and when the procedure was done and the cow was on her feet and breathing right, she looked at Oscar with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it not the reflexive thanks of politeness, but the specific, substantive kind that comes from genuine relief. "How is Sam?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Feverish," she said, "but it's stayed manageable. The worst of it seems to have passed." She paused, and he could see her deciding whether to say the next thing. "You should come in and have something to eat," she said finally. "It's the least I can offer." The kitchen of the Donnelly house was warm and lit by a good fire, and it smelled of bread and something savory on the stove. And Sam was installed on the settle near the hearth, wrapped in a quilt, pale but bright-eyed and deeply interested in Oscar's arrival. Oscar sat at the table and ate a bowl of thick vegetable soup and drank coffee that was proper and strong. And he and Eliza talked about cattle and weather and the winter ahead. And Sam fell asleep halfway through a question about whether Oscar had ever seen a real gunfight, which Oscar deflected by saying he hoped never to, which was the honest truth. When the boy was asleep, the conversation changed its character. Not dramatically, not into anything confessional or dramatic, but into something quieter and more genuine. Eliza refilled his coffee and sat across the table from him, and she looked tired in the way that people who never stop working always look tired, but also deeply capable, like iron that has been through enough fires to know its own strength. "You've been standing at the north pasture edge every evening," she said. It wasn't a question. Oscar met her eyes without apology. "I have," he said. "Why?" she asked. Not with suspicion or accusation, just a straightforward question from a woman who wanted a straightforward answer. He thought about it honestly. "The first evening I saw you there," he said, "I thought there was something wrong, like you might need something. And then when you went inside, I felt like I should have said something, but I didn't know what, and so the next evening I came back, and the one after that." He paused. "I wasn't meaning to intrude on your private time, I want you to know that." She was quiet for a moment, studying him. "Sam told you why I go there," she said. "He did. He tells everyone everything," she said, without any real complaint in it. "He comes by it honestly. Thomas was the same way." The name landed in the room softly, the way it does when someone has practiced saying it long enough that it no longer brings them to their knees. "It helped him to talk," she said. "Thomas, I mean, through anything. He could talk through any trouble." She looked at the sleeping boy. "Sam has it too." "And you?" Oscar asked. She looked back at him. "I am better at listening," she said. He nodded. He understood that. He was better at listening too. He rode home that night under a sky so thick with stars it seemed almost excessive, and he thought about the warmth of her kitchen and the way she had looked at the sleeping boy and the precise, careful way she had answered his question about why he stood at the pasture edge. He had been honest with her and she had accepted it, and now he was going to have to figure out what came next. What came next, it turned out, was a winter. The winter of 1874 to 1875 on the Kansas high plains was not a gentle one. November brought hard frosts and 2 early snows. December brought a week of temperatures that dropped to places that made the livestock miserable and the humans not much better. And January delivered a blizzard that kept everyone indoors for 4 days and left drifts against the barn walls that reached the eaves. Oscar managed his land and his animals with the dogged competence of a man who had learned from hard years, and he kept watch on the Donnelly property from what vantage points his own work allowed, and when the blizzard broke he rode over immediately. She had managed. Of course she had. The animals were alive. The house was warm. Sam had spent the blizzard building an elaborate fortification out of every spare blanket in the house, and appeared genuinely disappointed that the storm had ended, and the project had to be dismantled. But one of the barn's side walls had given way under the weight of the snow, and Hector Ruiz had headed south to visit family before the blizzard hit and wouldn't be back until March, and the barn needed repair before the next storm arrived. Oscar came back the following morning with timber and tools, and Eliza met him at the barn with her sleeves already rolled up. "I can help with the work," she said. "I don't need you to do it for me." "I know you don't," he said, "but it goes faster with 2 people, and I don't have anything more pressing today." She looked at him for a moment with that measuring quality she had, like she was checking whether there was any condescension in him and finding the answer satisfactory. "All right," she said. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and it was good work. The kind of purposeful, physical labor that doesn't leave much room for self-consciousness, where you simply do what needs doing and pass the nails and hold the timber and say what needs to be said, and don't worry much about how you're coming across. Sam appeared around noon wrapped in so many layers he could barely bend his arms, carrying a small hammer that he applied with great enthusiasm and minimal accuracy to anything within reach. Oscar gave him a real task holding a piece of timber steady while Oscar drove the nails, and the boy took it with a seriousness that was both touching and a little comic. "Is this hard?" Sam asked at one point, meaning the work. "A little," Oscar said. "Papa said building things was the best kind of hard," Sam said, "because you could see what you'd done when you were finished." Oscar drove the next nail in silence, and when he finished and looked up, he found Eliza watching him from across the barn with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. It was unguarded in a way that her face usually wasn't open, and something that was close to surprised, as though she had just noticed something she had not expected to notice. He looked back down at his work, because the moment felt like it needed space. They finished the barn wall in the late afternoon, and Eliza fed them both, all three of them, at the kitchen table, venison stew this time, and afterward Sam fell asleep with startling speed on the settle and Oscar, and Eliza sat at the table with the last of the coffee and talked for 2 hours in the quiet of the winter evening. She told him about Ohio and about coming west. She told him about the first winter, when the house was half built, and she and Thomas had spent the coldest nights wrapped in every blanket they owned, and how they'd laughed about it afterward even though at the time it hadn't been funny at all. She told him about the years before Sam, and the years after, and the way Thomas had been with the boy, patient and playful and good in all the ordinary ways that matter most. She didn't tell it with self-pity or with the performed grief of someone who wants acknowledgement. She told it the way you tell the truth about a life that was real, because the person across the table from you has earned the telling. Oscar told her about growing up in Missouri, and about the first cattle drive he'd taken at 17, and about the 7 years of trail work that had saved him enough to buy the McCready land. He told her about the specific quality of loneliness that comes with that kind of life, not unpleasant exactly, but cumulative, the way it builds up over years until you realize you've been a person mostly alone for a very long time. "Did you not want more than that?" she asked. She wasn't pressing him, just asking. "I didn't let myself," he said. "The life didn't support it, and I didn't want to be a man who promised things he couldn't keep." He paused. "But I have the land now." "The life is different." She looked at the fire for a moment. "It's different for me too," she said quietly. "This past year has been different." She looked back at him. "Not easier, but different. Like something shifted in the ground under me. I can feel it, but I don't know yet what it means." He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded, and she seemed to understand that he understood, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while before he put on his coat and rode home through the cold, clean dark. February came, and with it a thaw that lasted a week before the cold returned. And during that thaw the creek between their properties ran high and fast with meltwater, and Oscar built a simple plank bridge over the narrowest crossing point, so that passage didn't require rolling up trousers or navigating slippery stones. He did it without announcement and without ceremony, and when Eliza saw it she came and stood looking at it for a long moment before she looked at him. "Did you ask permission to build that on my side?" she said. "I should have," he said. She looked at the bridge again. "It's a good bridge," she said. "I'm glad you think so." She looked at him then, and the corners of her mouth moved in a way they hadn't moved before, not quite a smile yet, but the preparation for one, the territory immediately preceding it. "Thank you, Oscar," she said, using his first name for what was, he realized, the first time. He felt this in a way entirely disproportionate to the number of syllables involved. March arrived, and with it Hector Ruiz and his cousin Emilio returning from their winter south, and the business of spring beginning on both properties. The breaking of the soil where it needed breaking, the decisions about what to plant and where, the assessment of the livestock through winter, and the planning for summer. Oscar hired a young man named Cody Marsh from Callow to help him through the busy season, a 19-year-old with a good disposition and a willingness to learn, and things on his homestead fell into a working rhythm. He and Eliza saw each other regularly now, in the easy way of neighbors who have come through a winter together and established a working familiarity. She came across the plank bridge on occasion to consult him about his planting choices or to borrow a tool he had and she didn't. He came across to help with tasks that genuinely required more hands. Sam came across constantly, with or without invitation, having declared Oscar's homestead a territory of great interest and himself its primary explorer. Oscar found he didn't mind this in the slightest, but the evenings remained what they were. She still went to the edge of the east field at dusk, still stood with her face to the dying sky, still held that private conversation with the man she had loved and lost. And Oscar still found himself at the north pasture edge, looking east, keeping a vigil whose nature was changing under his feet without him having directed it to. He started thinking about it differently as spring opened the land back up. He was no longer standing there to watch over her. She didn't need watching over. He was standing there because being near her, even 400 yards of open grass near, was the part of the day he valued most. He stood at the edge of his land to be closer to her, and he knew it, and he had started to understand that the knowing was the point where something had to either happen or stop. It happened, as such things often do, sideways and without formal announcement. It was a warm evening in late April, the kind of evening that arrives in Kansas like an apology from the previous months, soft-haired and golden, the grass bright green from the spring rains, the creek running clear and easy. Oscar was at his usual station at the north pasture edge when he saw her coming across the plank bridge, not toward the east field but toward him, walking with the purposeful stride she had that always looked like a person who had decided something. She stopped at the fence line between their properties. He had put in a proper gate over the winter because it seemed sensible, and looked at him across it. "Why do you stand here every evening?" she asked. Not the way she had asked in November, cataloging information. This time the question was different. This time it was close to an accusation, but a gentle one, the kind that hopes to be answered honestly. "I think you know," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The sun was behind him, dropping, the sky starting to do its evening work. "Thomas has been gone for over a year and a half," she said. "I still go and talk to him every evening, and I'm not going to pretend that's going to stop being something I do. I don't know how to promise you it will." "I'm not asking you to promise that," he said. "I'm not—" She stopped and started again, and he could see it was costing her something, this conversation, which was why it mattered. "I am not the kind of woman who grieves quickly and moves on, Oscar. I loved my husband for 8 years. I'm not going to set that down like a piece of luggage." "I know that," he said. "So what are you doing here every evening?" she asked, and her voice had something in it now that wasn't quite steady. He reached out and opened the gate and stepped through onto her side of the property, and he stood 3 feet from her in the golden April light, and he said, "I'm not asking you to set anything down. I'm not asking you to stop loving Thomas Donnelly or to stop going to the field edge and talking to him. I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are." He paused. "I am asking if there is any room, somewhere in that life of yours, for me to be part of it." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite tears but was adjacent to them. The wind moved through the spring grass between them, and the last of the day's birds were singing themselves quiet. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's honest," he said. "I'm not a dishonest woman." "No," he said, "you're not." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she said, "Come to Sunday supper." And she turned and walked back across the bridge toward the east field, and took up her position at the edge of it in the falling dark. And Oscar stood and watched the sky change colors until she turned and went inside. And then he went inside too. Sunday supper was the first of several, and between them there were afternoons of planting and evenings of conversation and mornings of the kind of accidental proximity that stops being accidental after the third or fourth time. Sam, who was constitutionally transparent in his enthusiasms, made his feelings about the situation extremely clear by treating Oscar with the aggressive familiarity of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. One afternoon in May, Sam grabbed Oscar's hand as they were walking back from checking the corn seedlings and said, with the conversational ease of a 7-year-old announcing the weather, "I asked Papa if it was all right." Oscar looked down at him. "When did you do that?" "When Mama went to the field," Sam said. "I go sometimes too. I talked to him and asked if it would be all right if you were our friend." Oscar's throat did something complicated. "What did he say?" He asked because Sam had asked the question and Sam deserved an answer to be worked toward. Sam thought about it. "I didn't hear anything," the boy said, "but it felt like yes." He said it with complete confidence, the specific confidence of a child who has decided on a truth and found no reason to doubt it. Oscar reached down and put his hand briefly on the boy's head, ruffling the dark hair, and Sam tolerated this in the way of a boy who secretly likes it, but feels dignity requires minimal acknowledgement. May gave way to June, and the crops were up and growing, and the days were long and warm. And one evening Oscar came across the bridge for no official reason, no tool to return, no fence to discuss, no practical purpose whatsoever, and Eliza was sitting on her front porch with a cup of tea, and she looked at him when he came through her gate and said, "No excuse this time." "No," he said. "I just wanted to see you." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Sit down then." He sat and they watched the evening come in over the Kansas grass, and after a while she refilled his cup from the teapot she had and said, very quietly, "I've been thinking about what you asked. In April." He didn't say anything, he waited. "I've been thinking that the field edge is mine and Thomas's," she said. "It has been and it will be, but the porch is mine." She looked at him directly. "I can't give you the field edge, but you could share the porch with me." Oscar Rhodes sat very still for a moment and felt something that had been wound tight inside him for a long time begin very slowly to ease. "I'll take the porch," he said. She smiled then, a real smile, full and open, the first one he'd seen like that on her face, and it was like watching a light come on in a house you'd been standing outside of for a long time. It changed her face entirely, and he felt with simple and absolute certainty that he was going to love this woman for the rest of his life. He did not say this. He was not a man who rushed the things that mattered, but he knew it, and knowing was enough for now. Through June and July, things changed on both sides of the creek in quiet but significant ways. Oscar began appearing on the porch in the evenings regularly, and Eliza let him, and they talked about everything and nothing with the ease of two people who have figured out how to be honest with each other. She told him more about Thomas, not to maintain a distance, he came to understand, but because talking about Thomas was part of who she was, and if he was going to be in her life she was going to be all of herself. Oscar listened, and in the listening he came to know Thomas Donnelly through the shape he had left in the woman who loved him, and he found he didn't resent this. He respected it. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. About the drives, and about the years when he'd wondered if the wanting of something settled and permanent meant he was weak, and about the particular loneliness of a man who has been moving so long he's forgotten what staying feels like. She listened to all of it with that quality she had full presence, nothing held back from the attending. One evening she said, "Did you ever think you would do this? The homesteading, I mean, the settling." "I thought about it for years before I did it," he said. "I think I was afraid I'd do it wrong, get the land and then not know what to do with the life." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her across the porch in the warm dusk. "Now I think I might be figuring it out," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and there was something in her eyes that was different from what had been there before, something that had opened, cautiously, like a door being tested rather than thrown wide, but open nonetheless. In August, a problem arrived that had been building since before Oscar had come to the territory, though he hadn't known it yet. A man named Gideon Hart rode onto the Donnelly property one morning, while Oscar was there helping Hector and Emilio repair the south fence, and announced in the carrying voice of someone who is accustomed to having things his way that he was interested in purchasing the Donnelly land. Gideon Hart was a large cattle rancher who had been acquiring homestead properties to the south and east of Callow for the past 3 years, consolidating them into a single large operation. He was not a man who believed in the kind of small-scale farming that the homesteaders practiced, and he was not particularly subtle about it. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the expansive physical presence of someone who has never had to apologize for taking up space. Eliza came out of the house at the sound of his voice, and she stood on the porch steps with her arms folded, and she said, "Mr. Hart, I believe we have had this conversation before." "We have," Hart said pleasantly from the back of a big bay horse. "I believe I've been too conservative in my offer. I've come to correct that." "No offer would correct it," she said. "This land is not for sale." Hart's eyes moved past her to where Oscar was standing by the fence, and there was a calculation in them. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, "you are a woman alone, running 200 acres with seasonal hired men. The winter will come again as it always does, and these things don't get easier." "I am well aware of what winters are like," she said. "I have survived several of them without your advice." "I mean no disrespect," Hart said, in the tone of a man who means quite a lot of it. "I am offering fair value for land that must be a burden to you." Oscar set down the pliers he was holding and walked toward the house, not fast but steadily, the kind of movement that doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. He came to stand at the base of the porch steps below Eliza and facing Hart, and he said, "Mrs. Donnelly has given you her answer." Hart looked at him. "This is private business, Rhodes." "Mrs. Donnelly is my neighbor and my friend," Oscar said, "and I'm on her property at her invitation, and she has told you her answer. I'd say that covers it." There was a beat of silence, the kind where things are assessed and calculations are made. Hart was not a foolish man, and Oscar Rhodes, standing there in the August sun with the pliers still in his hand and a quiet in his face that was nothing like passivity, was not a man who invited escalation. "I'll come back when the lady has had time to reconsider," Hart said. "Save yourself the trip," Eliza said, from the porch steps behind Oscar. Hart nodded with the exaggerated courtesy of a man accepting a temporary setback and turned his horse and rode out through the gate, and Eliza watched him go with her jaw set and her eyes hard. "He won't stop," she said when Hart's dust had settled. "No," Oscar agreed. "Men like that generally don't." He looked up at her. "Has he been troubling you long?" "Since the spring after Thomas died," she said. "He came 3 times that year while I was still." She paused, and the pause contained the whole raw weight of the first year. "He thought I'd be desperate to sell. He was wrong." "He was wrong," Oscar agreed. She looked down at him, and something moved across her face, a recognition of some kind, warm and complicated. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." "I wasn't going anywhere," he said. After that, Oscar made a quiet point of being present and visible around the Donnelly property, with enough regularity that it became clear to anyone in the area that the widow Donnelly was not alone on her land. He told himself it was practical. He suspected Eliza knew it was more than that, and suspected she was allowing it, which amounted to its own kind of statement. Hart came back once more in September, and this time Eliza and Oscar were both in the yard, and Hart took one look at the situation and made his pitch briefly and received his refusal and rode away without the preamble he'd brought last time. He did not come back again. It was Mabel Briggs, delivering this news with characteristic efficiency over the counter at the general store in late September, who told Oscar that Hart had apparently decided to focus his acquisition efforts further south, near the Cimarron. People are saying it's because the Donnelly place has a man on it now, she said, with a very specific kind of casualness that was not casual at all. Oscar bought his supplies and said nothing in particular, and Mabel watched him go with the satisfied expression of someone who has put a thing in its proper context. September brought the first anniversary of Oscar's arrival in the territory. He marked it privately, standing at the north pasture edge in the early morning before anyone else was up, looking at the low sun on the grass and thinking about the year that had passed and the nature of what he had accumulated in it. Not cattle, not corn, not the material measure of a homestead's progress. Those things were real and he was satisfied with them. But what he had accumulated that mattered was sitting in a farmhouse 400 yards east, braiding Sam's hair before school or checking the almanac at the kitchen table, or standing at the edge of the east field at dusk, having the conversation he would always have with Thomas Donnelly. He had not kissed her. He had not said the exact words of what he felt, in their exact full form. He had implied and she had implied, and they had both understood the implications, but there was still a space between implication and declaration, and it was a space she needed time to close. He was patient. He was constitutionally suited to patience, more so than most things. But he was 32 years old, and he had been moving towards something his whole life that he hadn't been able to name, and he was beginning to understand with increasing clarity that the thing he had been moving toward was Eliza Donnelly's porch in the evenings and Sam Donnelly's questions, and the life that existed on the other side of that shallow creek. October came around again, 1 full year since the fence and the steers and the pliers, and the first time they'd stood 4 feet apart and exchanged words that mattered. The weather was turning, the air getting its edge back, and the evenings were shortening faster now, the dark coming earlier. Eliza had started coming to the porch earlier to catch the last of the light before the cold sent them inside. It was on one of these evenings, the sky going deep orange and purple above the flat horizon, that she said something that shifted the ground between them again. "I went to the field edge today," she said, "and I told Thomas about you." Oscar went still. "I told him about the fence and the bridge and the winter barn and the Sunday suppers and the porch evenings," she said. She was looking at the sky, not at him, but her voice was steady. "I told him you were a good man and that Sam liked you and that she stopped for a moment, that I had started looking forward to the evenings in a way that had nothing to do with grief." The silence after this had a quality of its own, full and careful and trembling at the edges. "What did it feel like?" Oscar asked. "Telling him. Like putting something down that had been very heavy," she said, "and also like permission, I suppose, from both of us." She looked at him then, and her eyes were bright and steady at once, which was exactly the way she was. "I am not finished grieving," she said. "I want you to understand that. I don't think grief has an end date, and I'm not going to pretend it does." "I understand that," he said, "but I also am—" She took a breath. "I am alive, Oscar, and I have been alive this whole year. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I have been falling in love with you. And I think you deserve to know that because you have been so patient and so good and so—" Her voice broke just slightly at its edge. "You have been so steady," she said. "I have never known anyone as steady as you." Oscar Rhodes had faced cattle stampedes and river crossings and plains blizzards, and a handful of situations requiring physical courage that he had met without much outward disturbance. He had never felt quite as undone as he did at this moment, sitting on Eliza Donnelly's porch in the October evening, with the woman he loved telling him she loved him back. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and then she did something he had only seen the preparation for before. She smiled that full, open, light-on-in-the-house smile, and this time it was directed entirely at him. "I love you," he said. Because she had been honest and he could be no less. "I know," she said, and then, "I love you too, I have for a while now. I just needed to know I was saying it true and not because I was lonely or frightened or any of the things that can make a person say things they don't fully mean." "And now you know it's true?" he asked. Yes, she said, simply, without performance. The most certain yes he had ever heard. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, and she watched him do this with that steadiness she had, and the October sky did its extravagant work above them, and the coyotes started up somewhere out in the dark grass, and the creek ran between their properties with its quiet, persistent sound. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in, and when he finally walked back across the bridge in the dark, he carried the weight of her hand in his all the way home. November and December of 1875 were different from the previous year in every way that mattered. They were still hard months. The cold was real and the work was constant, and there was always something that needed doing, but they had a warmth at their center now that changed their character entirely. Oscar came to supper on Sunday and on Thursday too, and on most of the evenings between he came to the porch, and when the cold got too bitter for the porch, they sat by the kitchen fire instead. Sam, observing these developments with the complete satisfaction of someone who had arranged a great deal of it through strategic use of conversation and small hand-holdings, asked Oscar one evening, while Eliza was in the other room, whether Oscar was going to marry his mother. Oscar looked at him steadily. "I would very much like to," he said, "but that's your mother's decision." Sam considered this. "She likes you," he said, "more than she likes most people. She doesn't let most people sit at our table this many times." He appeared to feel this constituted useful information. "She let you sit at the table when you fixed our cow and she barely knew you. I remember thinking that was different." "What was different about it?" Oscar asked. Sam thought about it with the frowning concentration he brought to problems. "She looked comfortable," he said. "Mama doesn't usually look comfortable with people she doesn't know. She looked comfortable with you even then." He seemed to feel this mystery had now been adequately analyzed. "She told Mabel Briggs you were a good man," he added. "When did she say that?" "October," Sam said. "I was in the store looking at the candy jars and they thought I wasn't listening, but I was always listening. I'm very good at listening." Oscar made a mental note that no conversation in the general vicinity of Sam Donnelly should be considered private. He asked Eliza to marry him on a Thursday evening in late January after supper, when Sam had gone to bed, and the fire was burning low, and they were sitting close together on the settle in the comfortable way they had developed, her shoulder warm against his arm. He didn't make a speech of it because she wasn't a woman who needed speeches, but he said what was true and said it directly. "I want to marry you, Eliza," he said. "I want to be your husband and Sam's father, and I want us to build this life together on both pieces of this land, and I want to sit on your porch for the rest of my life and watch the evenings come in." He paused. "I understand what you carry. I don't want you to carry it alone anymore." She looked at him with her gray eyes in the firelight, and he could see her taking the measure of what he had said, not doubting it, but weighing it carefully the way she weighed every important thing, turning it to examine each face of it before she committed. "Yes," she said, "just that, but with everything in it." He put his arms around her and held her close, and she let herself be held, and they stayed that way for a long time in the firelight, while the wind worked at the windows and the Kansas dark pressed patient and big against the glass. Sam, who had not in fact gone to sleep, and who would later claim he heard nothing and had simply come for a glass of water, appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the scene with one sweeping assessment, and said, "Finally," in a tone so practiced it was clear he had been waiting to deliver it. Eliza pointed at the stairs without even looking at him and said, "Bed," with a firmness that contained no anger and all the authority in the world, and Sam went, trailing satisfaction like a comet trailing light. They married in March of 1876, in the small church in Callow, whose paint was still losing its argument with the weather, but which was filled that morning with everyone from the surrounding homesteads, who had watched the year of standing and waiting and quiet convergence with the invested attention of people who genuinely hope for good outcomes. Mabel Briggs cried happily throughout the service and made no attempt to hide it. Hector Ruiz and Emilio wore their best shirts and sat in the front row alongside Cody Marsh, who had been with Oscar through the full farming season and had developed a fond loyalty to both families. Eliza wore a dress she had made herself from good deep blue wool, and her dark hair was pinned up with a small spray of dried wildflowers, and she walked down the aisle of the little church with Sam at her side, in the role he had insisted upon with the complete confidence of a boy who understood his own importance in this story. She looked at Oscar at the front of the church, and he looked at her, and neither of them looked anywhere else. The minister, a quiet man named Reverend Aldous, who had seen more of the range of human experience than his modest manner suggested, performed the ceremony with a simplicity and sincerity that suited them both exactly. When Oscar took Eliza's hand and said the words, he said them looking directly into her eyes, and she said hers back with the clarity and steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about her. Afterward there was a dinner in the open air outside the church Mabel, and several other women had organized this, with an efficiency that might have intimidated a military general, with food enough for twice the gathering and music from a fiddle player named Jessup, who had ridden in from 15 miles south, and who played with the kind of joyful disregard for technique that nonetheless produced something wonderful. Oscar danced with Eliza in the dust outside the church, his hand at her waist and hers at his shoulder, and she danced the way she did most things, competently and without self-consciousness. And when the music slowed and he pulled her a little closer, she came without hesitation. Sam danced with Mabel Briggs, and then with 3 different girls his own age with the free-spirited enthusiasm of a boy who has no opinions yet about whether dancing is dignified, and who was operating on the pure fuel of a very good day. They rode home in the early evening, the 3 of them, across the Kansas grass, to the Donnelly homestead where Eliza and Sam had lived and would continue to live, with Oscar's property managed alongside it in the practical arrangement they had worked out over the winter. The 2 farms operated as one now, the creek between them a landmark rather than a border, the plank bridge worn smooth with use. That evening, for the first time, Oscar stood with Eliza at the edge of the east field. She hadn't asked him to come, and he hadn't asked if he could. It had simply happened, the way things do when they are right. She had walked toward the field at dusk out of habit and intention, and he had walked with her without thinking about it, and they were standing together at the far edge of the plowed ground as the sky began its evening drama. She stood quietly for a moment, and then she spoke softly, the way she always did at the field edge, not to Oscar, but to the air and the light and the memory that lived there. She said a few quiet words that he didn't try to hear clearly, because they were private. And then she was silent, and the wind moved through the spring grass, and somewhere a meadowlark was making its last statement of the day. She took Oscar's hand. He held it and they stood together in the fall of the light, and he understood that he was not taking Thomas Donnelly's place. You couldn't take a person's place. You could only stand in the life that existed, in all its complexity and history and irreducible humanness, and be present in it. He was present. He was hers and she was his, and Thomas Donnelly's memory was part of this land and this woman and therefore part of all of it, and that was not a diminishment of anything. It was simply the truth. They walked back to the house in the dark, hand in hand, and Sam had made a moderately disastrous attempt at supper that had produced scrambled eggs and burned toast, which he presented with the pride of someone who has performed a miracle, and they ate it and thanked him, and the kitchen was warm and full of light. The seasons turned. Summer of 1876 brought good rains and good crops and the particular pleasure of hard work shared with people you loved. Oscar and Eliza worked their combined land with Hector and Emilio and Cody, and the yield was better than either farm had produced independently, because there were simply more hands and more planning, and the practical benefit of 2 minds that complemented each other well. Sam grew over that summer in the accelerated way of boys who are happy. An inch and then another, his voice beginning to hint at what it would become. his interests expanding to include Oscar's horses and the mechanics of the farm equipment and the wide-ranging questions that a 7-year-old turning 8 produces at a rate that kept Oscar in a state of ongoing conversation. He called Oscar by his first name because that was how it had started and because Eliza left the decision to him. Oscar never pressed for more. Sam would find his own way to whatever it was going to be. One afternoon in August, Sam came to find Oscar in the barn where he was working on a harness and sat down on a hay bale and was quiet for longer than was usual for him, which meant something was working itself out. "Can I ask you something?" Sam said. "Always," Oscar said. "Is it all right to have two fathers?" Sam asked. "Like, one who was here before and one who is here now." Oscar set the harness down and looked at the boy. "I think that's very all right," he said. "Some people have one father their whole life. Some people have more than one, different ones at different times. What matters is that the love is real." "Is yours real?" Sam asked, not confrontationally but with genuine curiosity, the kind of question only a child would ask directly enough to get the real answer. "Yes," Oscar said. "It is completely real." Sam nodded, absorbing this. Then he said, "Then I think you should know that I've decided to call you Pa when I feel like it." He said it with the combination of shyness and determination that was uniquely his, as though he'd been practicing the decision and had finally committed to it. Oscar felt something happen in his chest that he was pretty sure he would feel the echo of for the rest of his life. "I'd like that very much," he said. Sam nodded as though a matter of business had been concluded and slid off the hay bale and went back out to whatever he'd been doing before, and Oscar sat in the barn for a few minutes before he trusted his face to be normal again. He told Eliza that evening, in the quiet after Sam was in bed, and she looked at him across the kitchen table with those gray eyes that held everything they felt openly, and she reached across and put her hand over his and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. By the spring of 1877, Eliza was carrying their child. She told Oscar on a morning in March with the plain, straight-ahead manner she brought to every important thing, and he received the news the same way with a stillness that was not restraint but the particular quality of a feeling too large and too certain to require performance. He took her face in his hands and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the kitchen, while the morning light came through the window, and Sam ate his breakfast at the table with elaborate innocence, and then looked up and said, "Is something happening?" "Come here," Eliza said and told him, and Sam's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling into a radiance that was purely and completely his mother's. "A baby," he said, and then practically, "Do I get to help?" "You will help enormously," Oscar told him. The pregnancy was unremarkable in all the best ways. Eliza was healthy and capable and constitutionally resistant to being limited, which meant Oscar spent considerable time suggesting rest without in any way attempting to mandate it, because he understood that mandating things to Eliza Donnelly was not a strategy with a good historical record. She slowed slightly through the summer heat and accepted help on the tasks that became genuinely difficult, but she was at her field edge every evening and on the porch every night the weather allowed, and at the kitchen table for every conversation that mattered. The baby arrived on a November morning in 1877, safe and loud about it, delivered by the capable hands of a woman named Clara Fenn, who served as the local midwife, and who had been through this particular process enough times to be calm when everything around her was not. Oscar was kept outside for much of it, which he endured with less patience than he typically managed, while Sam sat next to him on the porch steps and provided a continuous narrative of what was probably happening based on what he had overheard from adults over the years, which was both more and less accurate than might be expected. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas William Donnelly Rhodes, Thomas for the man who had loved this land and this woman before Oscar, and William for Oscar's father, and Donnelly Rhodes because he was made of everything that had come before him and everything that was new. Oscar held the baby that first evening in the lamplight with the careful hands of a man who had handled most things in his life with competent ease, and was finding that this particular weight required him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his own capacity for tenderness. The baby was small and red and absolutely furious about existing, and Oscar thought he was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. Sam sat on the bed beside his mother, who was tired in the deeply satisfied way of someone who has accomplished something major, and looked at his new brother with the complex expression of a child doing the mathematics of how this changes things. "He looks like a potato," Sam said. "He does a little," Eliza agreed with complete serenity. "He'll look better later," Oscar said. "He will," Eliza said. "And you looked much the same, Sam, so there is no reason for superiority." Sam appeared to feel that this was an unfair comparison but was willing to let it go. The winter of 1877 to 1878 was different from all the winters before it because the house was full of the kind of weight that only a baby brings, the particular quality of nights reorganized around someone new and small. The way the morning light looked different when it fell on a sleeping infant, the redistribution of everything ordinary by a presence that was entirely new. Sam adapted with surprising grace, deploying his natural communicativeness in the service of entertaining his brother, who was at this stage largely unable to appreciate it but would come to in time. He had decided that being an older brother was an important occupation and threw himself into it with characteristic commitment. Oscar did the nights without complaint, which surprised Eliza because she had expected to carry that work alone by habit and history. He was up when little Thomas, as Sam had taken to calling him to distinguish him, though he usually just said the baby, in a tone of someone who has not yet decided whether this is an imposition or an asset woke in the dark, and he walked the kitchen floor with the infant against his shoulder with the same steadiness he brought to everything. And when Eliza came to relieve him, he sometimes refused for an extra half hour because the baby had gone quiet and was simply present in his arms. And he was not in a hurry to put that down. She found him one morning in the kitchen just before dawn, standing at the window with the baby asleep against his shoulder, and the cold dark outside, and the first gray line of morning beginning at the horizon. He didn't know she was there for a moment, and she stood in the doorway and looked at this man she had chosen and the child they had made, and something settled completely into place in her, something that had been moving towards settling since a September evening in 1874, when she had first noticed a man standing at the north pasture edge looking east. She had loved Thomas Donnelly, and she would carry that love always. And she loved Oscar Rhodes, and she would carry that too, and neither love diminished the other, and the field edge was still hers and Thomas's at dusk, and the rest of the life was hers and Oscar's, and it all fit together in the way that truth usually does when you stop trying to make it into something simpler. "Come to bed," she said softly. He turned, and when he saw her his face did the thing it did sometimes, opened up, briefly, in a way that his careful face didn't usually permit, showing everything underneath. He looked at her and then at the sleeping baby and then back at her, and she crossed the kitchen floor and put her arms around him from the side, careful of the baby, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me," he said quietly, "aside from Sam and this one, but you came first." "I know," she said. "You're the best thing that has happened to me too." She paused. "Aside from the same." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they stood in the kitchen while the morning gathered itself outside, until little Thomas stirred and required attention, and the day began. 1878 moved through its seasons in the particular way of years that contained sufficient happiness, not without trouble, because no year is without trouble, but with the trouble occurring inside a life that was strong enough to hold it. Hector and Emilio had settled in the region more permanently now, Hector having married a woman from a neighboring homestead the previous spring, and the working relationships between the properties had become the kind of lasting arrangements that form the real connective tissue of communities. Cody Marsh, the young man Oscar had hired in that first spring, had developed into a skilled and reliable farmhand and a family friend. Sam had turned 9 and had taken on real responsibilities with the animals in the mornings, responsibilities he discharged with a dedication that made Oscar proud and Eliza smile in a certain way she had. Sam had also, by the summer of 1878, started calling Oscar Pa, with the casual ease of someone who has thoroughly adjusted to a name and no longer thinks about it as a choice. He never stopped also visiting the field edge sometimes, talking to Thomas Donnelly in the quiet way his mother had shown him. Oscar thought this was right and good. The living and the remembered were not in competition. There was room for both. One evening in late summer, Sam came to Oscar while he was checking on the horses and said, with the tone of someone delivering useful information, "I was at the field edge and I told Papa about little Thomas." Oscar looked at him. "How did it feel?" he asked, the same question he had asked 4 years ago about a different conversation. Sam thought about it. "Like it felt like yes again," he said, "like he was glad." "I think he would be," Oscar said. "Do you think he knows about you?" Sam asked. Oscar considered this honestly. "I think your father knew the kind of man your mother was," he said. "I think he knew she would be all right. I think he knew she would love right." Sam absorbed this with a slow nod. "I think so too," he said, and went back to the horses. Fall of 1878, and the Kansas grass was turning again, the amber rolling across the land in that particular light that had first stopped Oscar in his tracks 4 years ago at the top of a small rise with wire in his hands. He was standing there again now, the same rise, the north pasture edge, but standing differently, not watching and waiting, simply looking at his land, which extended east to the creek and across the bridge to what had been the Donnelly farm and was now simply their farm, their life, this thing they had built together from 2 separate and good halves. He saw her at the east field, as he always did at this hour. She was standing at the edge, talking to Thomas Donnelly in the way she always would, and Oscar stood at his original station on the rise and looked across the 400 yards of evening grass and the creek and the bridge. And he thought about the first evening he had seen her still against the burning sky, grieving in the extraordinary way of someone who does not make grief small. He had stood here then to be closer to her. He stood here now because it was where the story had started, and he was a man who remembered his own stories and liked to stand in the places where the good things had begun. After a while she turned from the field edge and looked toward him. She always knew where he was, with the particular awareness of someone you are attuned to. And even across the distance he could see her clearly, his wife in the last of the day's light, and she lifted one hand in a small wave that was unhurried and certain, and he raised his hand back. He walked down from the rise and across the creek, and she met him at the edge of the east field, where the wheat stubble was rough under their feet, and the first stars were coming out, and she put her hand in his, and they walked back toward the house together, where the lamp was lit in the kitchen window and Sam's voice was audible through the walls. He was narrating something to little Thomas, who was at the age of finding all narration delightful, and the smell of something good on the stove was already reaching them across the yard. Eliza stopped him just before the porch steps and turned to look at him in the dark, and her face was clear and open, and his entirely. "I was thinking today," she said. "What about?" he asked. "About what I would have told my younger self," she said. "The one who came west with Thomas and thought she knew the shape of her whole life." She paused. "I would have told her the shape changes, and the changing is not the end of things, it is just things being alive." Oscar looked at her and thought about his own younger self, the one riding cattle trails with nothing ahead but more of the same, telling himself the moving was enough and not quite believing it. "I would have told myself to stop drifting sooner," he said. "I would have told myself that standing still in the right place is better than moving through all the wrong ones." She smiled that full smile that he had first seen in October of 1875 and had never once taken for granted. "We got here," she said. "We got here," he said. She kissed him on the porch in the dark, and it was warm and unhurried and full of everything they were. And from inside the house, Sam's voice went briefly louder as he apparently reached the climax of whatever story he was telling the baby. They went inside. The years that followed the winter of 1878 carried the particular quality of a life that knows what it is. There were hard seasons and there were generous ones, and the crops had their failures and their triumphs, and the children grew. Little Thomas walked at 11 months and talked at 12, beginning immediately with sentences rather than single words, as though he had been waiting impatiently through the preceding year, and now had things to say. He had Oscar's coloring darker than Sam and Eliza's particular way of looking at things directly, and he took to the land as though he had a specific arrangement with it, gravitating always toward the animals and the earth and the outdoor work with a natural ease that made Oscar think of the way certain things have affinities. Sam went through the transformations of boyhood into youth with the same openness he had always had, never quite losing the quality that made him naturally communicative with the whole world around him. He was good at school, better at people, and had the specific gift of being trusted by both children and adults, which in a frontier community turned out to be genuinely valuable. He helped run the farm with real competence by the time he was 12, and by 13, he was the person Eliza sent to Callow on farm business, because he negotiated better than most grown men, a fact he handled with becoming modesty. A third child arrived in the spring of 1880, a girl, pink and loud, and already possessed of opinions by the time she was 2 hours old. They named her Mary Clara Donnelly Rhodes, Mary for Eliza's mother and Clara for the midwife who had become a family friend. Sam declared himself an excellent older brother of demonstrated experience and took this role seriously from day one. Thomas, at 2.5, was largely puzzled but not opposed. Oscar sat by Eliza in the hours after Mary arrived, in the same room where little Thomas had arrived before her, and held her hand and watched her sleep, and thought about how a life accumulates. Not just in property and livestock and the ledger book, but in this, in the specific weight of people loved and kept and built toward, in the rooms that had been filled with sound and meals and arguments and forgiveness, and all the ordinary astonishments that make up the time of a life worth living. In the spring of 1881, Callow grew. 2 new homesteading families arrived from Missouri, and a doctor established a proper practice in a building on the main street, and the church got painted, really painted, this time, and it stayed white and clean for longer than the previous effort, and there was talk of a telegraph line coming through. The West was changing, as it always had been, and the people who lived in it changed with it or didn't, each according to their own nature. Oscar and Eliza were part of the change and part of the permanence simultaneously, which is the particular place that long-rooted people occupy in a growing community. They had been there long enough to know the land's moods and the season's patterns, and new arrivals found their way to Oscar Rhodes for advice on soil and weather and the particular character of the territory. Eliza ran a kitchen garden that had expanded considerably over the years, and that she now shared the produce of with the wider community in good seasons, dried herbs and vegetables, and once, memorably, a great quantity of preserved peaches that became one of the pleasures of the community's winter. The children grew. Sam turned 14 in 1882, and he had Oscar's height by then, already reaching for the same lean ranginess, though he had Eliza's darker coloring, and he had made himself into a young man of genuine substance, thoughtful and honest and capable. He had Thomas Donnelly's gift for talk and Thomas Donnelly's goodness with people, and he had Oscar Rhodes's steadiness and capacity for work, and he had Eliza's straight-seeing precision, and from all of this he had made himself into a person entirely his own. One evening in the fall of that year, Sam came to find Oscar after supper and sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I've been thinking about going to study law in Dodge City." There's a man there who takes on clerks and teaches the legal work. Oscar looked at him steadily. What does your mother say? She says to ask you, Sam said. She says you know more about what that kind of life requires. Oscar understood the weight of this, Eliza trusting him with the guidance of her first son, the boy whose existence she had carried alone through grief and hard winters, and who had then carried her right back. He gave the question the honesty it deserved. What I know, Oscar said, is that you are good enough to do it, and I know that your mother and I will miss you considerably, and I know that this land will be here. He paused, meaning something specific by this. And what I know most is that your father, the one before me, was a man who built things, and you come by it right. If the law is what you want to build, you should build it. Sam looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, Pa, and the word contained in it the full 7 years since he had first tentatively placed it on Oscar's shoulders, and all the living that had happened since. Thank you. Thank me by being good at it, Oscar said. Sam left for Dodge City in the spring of 1883, and the house was different without him in the specific irreversible way that marks a child's growing up departure. Eliza felt it sharply and allowed herself to feel it, standing at the field edge on the evening after his wagon had gone and speaking probably to both Thomas Donnellys at once. Oscar gave her the privacy of that evening and was there on the porch when she came back, and she sat next to him and he put his arm around her and she leaned into it. He's all right, she said. He is, Oscar agreed. Thomas would have been so proud of him, she said. He would, and he should be. You made him what he is. She looked at him. We made him what he is, she said. He held her closer, and the fall dark came in over the prairie, and little Thomas and Mary could be heard inside engaged in a debate of some kind with the particular intensity of children who feel something of consequence is at stake. And the lamp burned in the kitchen window, and the creek ran between its banks with its old familiar sound. Oscar was 39 years old that fall, and his face had more of the plains in it than it once had. The sun had written there, and the wind had added its comments. But he was strong and well and deeply, completely happy in the specific way of a person who has found the life they were built for and is living it fully. He still stood at the north pasture edge sometimes at dusk, just to stand in the place where things had started, just to feel the continuity of it, the September evening when he had first seen a dark-dressed woman against a burning sky and not understood what he was seeing. The October evening when she had asked why he stood there, and he hadn't had a complete answer. The slow accumulating winter of learning her, the spring of the bridge, the year of standing at his edge while she stood at hers, inching toward each other through the careful and necessary distance of grief and time. He had been patient, because she was worth the patience, and because patience is not the absence of wanting, but the understanding that some things have their own time and forcing them damages what they could become. She had loved Thomas Donnelly and she loved Oscar Rhodes, and she stood at the field edge every evening as long as she lived, and Oscar never once begrudged her a single moment of it, because the field edge was the place where her love had been faithfully kept, and that faithfulness was part of what made her who she was. Sam came home the following summer having passed his clerkship examinations with the results of someone who had always been better at things than he was willing to acknowledge. He came back lean and confident and full of the new world he'd been in, and he brought with him a young woman from Dodge City named Ruth, who had dark eyes and a quick mind, and who assessed the Rhodes Donnelly homestead with such thorough satisfaction that Eliza liked her immediately. The wedding was the following spring. The church in Callow was even cleaner now, and the crowd was larger than it had been for Oscar and Eliza's wedding 6 years before, because the community had grown. Sam stood at the front of that church and watched Ruth walk toward him with an expression that Oscar recognized from the inside, the expression of a man who is looking at his whole future and finding it not frightening but beautiful. Thomas Rhodes, at 8 years old, was the most serious ring-bearer in the history of Callow's church, taking the responsibility with a gravity that produced suppressed smiles throughout the assembled congregation. Mary, at 3, sat with Eliza in the front row and fell asleep on her mother's lap halfway through the service, and was carried out with a care that didn't disturb the ceremony. Oscar stood beside Eliza in the church and held her hand through the service, and she leaned against him slightly, and around them was the full assembled life they had built: Sam at the altar becoming a husband, Thomas holding rings with great concentration, Mary sleeping through history in her mother's arms, Hector and his wife in the second row, Mabel Briggs crying exactly as she had cried at Oscar and Eliza's wedding, and with the same lack of apology. He leaned down and said quietly near her ear, "Are you happy?" She turned and looked up at him, and those gray eyes held the full count of what they had been through together. The fence line and the bridge, the blizzard and the barn, the field edge and the porch, the proposals and the marriages and the children and the losses and the vast continuing work of the life. And she said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "Yes." He pressed his lips to her temple, and the fiddle at the back of the church began to play for the newly married couple. And outside, the spring Kansas sky was doing its excessive, generous thing with the light, pouring gold across the grass and the creek and the plank bridge worn smooth by 15 years of crossing, and the edge of the east field where the wheat was just beginning to show green against the dark earth, and all of the country that stretched from their land to the horizon, wide and permanent, and full of every kind of human story that had ever needed telling. In the evening of that day, after the celebration had gone on long enough and the families had settled, and the new couple had driven south toward the small house Sam had arranged in Callow, Oscar and Eliza walked together to the edge of the east field. They stood side by side in the last of the light, and she spoke quietly for a few minutes in the way she always did, and Oscar stood beside her and held her hand, and listened to the wind in the grass and the creek in its bed, and the particular silence of an evening when you have been given more than you ever thought to ask for. Little Thomas found them there, as he sometimes did now, 8 years old and beginning to understand things he hadn't before, the way children do at that age when the world becomes complicated and interesting simultaneously. He came and stood on his mother's other side, and she put her arm around him, and the three of them stood at the field edge in the dying light, and the Kansas sky did what it always did, enormous and uncomplicated, red and gold and then purple, the stars arriving one at a time like punctuation in a sentence being composed above them. "Is this what you do every evening?" Thomas asked. "It is," Eliza said. "Because of my other father?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "And because evenings are worth standing still for." Thomas considered the sky. "Pa stands at the north pasture edge sometimes," he said. "I've seen him." "I know," she said, and looked at Oscar over their son's head and smiled. "Why does he do that?" Thomas asked. Oscar looked down at his son in the falling dark, and he thought about a September evening 15 years gone, a fence line in need of repair, a dark-dressed woman standing still against a burning sky, and the particular stubbornness of standing at the edge of your own land because the edge nearest to something you love is still the closest you can get. "Because some places in the world are where the important things started," Oscar said, "and it does something good in a person to go back to them, to remember." Thomas thought about this with the furrowed concentration he brought to all important questions. "What started there?" he asked. Oscar looked at Eliza, and Eliza looked at Oscar, and between them was 15 years and a creek and a bridge and a boy who had grown and a boy who was growing and a girl asleep in the house, and a life so full and real it sometimes felt too large to look at directly. "Us," Oscar said. Thomas accepted this with a nod, the way he accepted most things, and the three of them stood at the edge of the field as the last color left the sky and the first stars strengthened, and the coyotes began their nightly conversation out in the dark grass, and the creek ran its steady, patient course between the two properties that had become one life, and the lamp in the kitchen window was a warm, specific light against the dark. They walked home together, the three of them, through the spring-warm Kansas evening, and the door opened before they reached it. Mary, awake now, standing in the doorway in her nightgown with her dark hair loose, saying, "Supper is cold and I am very hungry," with the certainty of a child who believes her needs are cosmically significant. Eliza said, "Then we shall heat it," and swept her daughter up and carried her inside, and Thomas followed, and Oscar stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the land, his land, their land, the land in the last of the light. The north pasture rise was just visible against the darkening sky. The creek was a sound in the dark. The bridge was there, worn and sure. The east field was a darkness beyond the yard, and the field edge where she stood every evening was a place he now knew the way he knew his own hands completely, and without having to think about it. He had arrived at this land a man alone, with calluses on his hands and a long history of moving and not much practice at staying. He was staying now. He went inside and closed the door, and the warmth of the house surrounded him, and his wife was heating supper and his daughter was demanding attention, and his son was telling some elaborate story to the room in general. And Oscar Rhodes sat down at the kitchen table of the life he had built and found it exactly enough, more than enough. Everything, in fact, that a life was supposed to be. Outside, the Kansas dark settled over the land with its usual complete authority, and the stars came out in their thousands, and the coyotes sang, and the creek ran, and the grass moved in the night wind, and the land was what it had always been, vast and indifferent and occasionally brutal and unspeakably beautiful, and full, tonight and always, of people trying to love each other right.